Hello everyone, today we'll be taking a look at the high-grade Gundam Ground Type S. If you haven't seen this kit before, don't worry about it. Not only is it from Gundam Thunderbolt, the kit is a pretty rare one, even for Thunderbolt standards. Some of the high-grade Thunderbolt kits have gotten sporadic reprints, but this isn't one of them, which is a shame. I actually never got this kit when it was first released in 2017, instead having to stalk the internet for it. And it's not that you can't find high-grade Thunderbolt kits out there, it's finding one for a fair price which is the issue. And from my experience, fair in Thunderbolt terms is around $50 to $60, but I really like this kit. It goes together quickly and shares several runners with the high-grade Thunderbolt gym, so you do get some spare parts, which is always great for kit bashes. It comes with the entire Thunderbolt gym backpack minus the thruster nozzles, and if you're a confident scratch builder, you could use these parts to recreate the Thunderbolt version of the gym cannon or gun cannon, which we never got kits of. I don't do a lot of Federation suits and even less Gundams, but this is one I had to pick up, not just because I'm a big fan of Thunderbolt, I really like the design. For a Gundam, it seems a lot like a grunt suit, and in the Gundam lore this isn't even a true Gundam, but a remodeled gym with a head that resembles a Gundam head, which doesn't even have a V-fin, but the Federation star instead. This is also a Thunderbolt redesign which actually feels different to me. It's not just a one-year war MS with slightly different proportions and a backpack with subarms. But on that note, the one part I think the kit lacks in is the subarms. Aside from having the subarms folded, you get two extras. One can hold the beam rifle while the other holds the shield. But you don't get two shield holding arms or two beam rifle holding arms, which makes posing quite limited. You also don't get any open hands, but you do get beam rifle hands for both arms, which is quite nice and something you don't really even get for some modern high grades. I started painting the joints first to make any repainting a little easier, and I've never painted the joints like this before on Thunderbolt kits. I usually prime in black and paint both the joints as well as the metallic parts by hand. But I wanted to see how this would turn out, as having to essentially repaint a kit twice can get a bit tedious. Before painting, I primed with the usual Mr. Surfacer, but instead of a Tamiya metallic, I used a Vallejo one, mainly because I've bought out and used all the TS42 and TS40 my local shops have. It's kind of funny how that one works, but this will make an interesting comparison with the metallic undercoats I'm used to. And now I'm just painting the main color. I am painting this Gundam in anime colors, but I am tweaking them a bit based on my own preferences. But like most Federation suits, the main color of this Gundam is white. When I normally paint white, especially for something in this scale, I never use an actual white. White is a tricky color to hand paint, and I do know the thing miniature painters do, where they paint multiple coats of increasingly lighter grays until they get to white, but that's too fussy for me, and I think stark white looks too cold. So instead, I use a very light gray. In this scale, a very light gray will read as white, but it's much easier to work with. But this is a ground type Gundam, so I wanted this color to reflect that. I add some stone gray and some London gray, which slightly darken the color and add a slightly tan tint. My final color ends up being like an eggshell instead of a true white. And while choosing these colors, I took some cues from the 8th MS team, and I think this color would be great for the Gundam EZ8 from that franchise. And I also want to bring this up, but if my paint ratios I'm putting on screen seem weird, it's because I mix things up based on what I think works together. I don't test things out beforehand, and I'm sure it's possible to simplify the ratios while achieving a similar result. I'm actually glad I've started to include these ratios, so I can always reference these videos if I want to achieve something similar in the future. It's just that mixing 9 parts of one color to 2 parts of another to 1 part of another is a little difficult to remember. I'm sure you can imagine that. And now we're just painting some of the parts blue. The original blue for this is like a navy blue. It looks almost regal, and although I like that color, I don't think it really fits the ground war grunt suit aesthetic. So I use a touch of gray to desaturate my mix and make it match better with the off-white I painted earlier. If this was a space use MS, I would keep the dark blue and not lighten or desaturate it. It's just that in my mind, this kind of blue fits and just matches better with the off-white. Now this may sound weird coming from someone who mainly builds and paints Xeon suits, but I really like Federation color schemes. By keeping the secondary color, in this case blue, pretty restricted, you get some visual interest, but it's just the right amount without overpowering the off-white. I wanted to take a break from the main body, so I'm just painting the backpack. This is a gray I use on all of my weapons, so I thought it'd be perfect for the backpack of this Gundam. It's a color I can rely on for all things mechanical, dark but neutral at the same time. The ground type has some yellow parts, so I'm just painting those. I'm using Mecha Colors yellow mainly. It's my favorite yellow paint, but I do add a little yellow ochre to tone it down and make it easier to work with. Yellow can be a notorious color to paint since your undercoat really influences how it'll end up. If you paint it over a really dark color, it can look a little sickly and gross. Now Mecha Color Yellow is a paint that I like. Some of the lighter Mecha Color paints have some coverage issues, but the yellow is actually surprising. It's also a color that dries unexpectedly tough. I've sanded this yellow down and I've had no problems with it. And last, I'm just painting the bottom parts of the feet. These are a dark blue in the anime, but they look like rubber to me, so I'm painting them a really dark gray. Covering the feet of a mech with rubber to avoid it damaging surface is a really cool concept, and it reminds me of how modern militaries use rubber track blocks on their tanks and other tracked vehicles to avoid the tracks destroying roads. Here it is after painting. This paint coat isn't the neatest and the most even, and some of the paint has even worn off, but that's okay because this is going to be a weathered build, starting off with physical chipping. Physical chipping is a technique I do on all of my builds. It's quicker than painting your chips on by hand, and creates in-scale chipping and scratched effects, although it can seem a bit intimidating to actually remove your paint coat. In some cases, if you are a bit heavy-handed, you can work down to the bare plastic. I use 3 tools for this: metal tweezers, sandpaper, and my hobby knife, all to attack my paint coat and show off the metallic undercoat. I actually wanted to talk about undercoats in this video, rather than the technique of physical chipping itself. As I said in the beginning, I usually use a Tamiya spray lacquer for the undercoat. Tamiya's metallics are very tough, and I do like the colors. But the way your undercoat looks is one thing, how it shows up during chipping is another. The silver I use is much more obvious when I chip away the blue, rather than when I chip away the off-white. And when you have 2 colors that are so different like these, one color's chipping will always be more dominant than the other. I usually use TS42 light gunmetal. It's a nice color, but when I paint with darker colors, the chipping isn't so obvious. In my most recent build, the High Grade of Free Custom, I used a metallic black instead. And when I posted pictures of that build to Instagram, people commented on the scratches, even though I've been doing physical chipping for a while. It's just that in that build, they could actually see the effect easily. I'm keeping the weathering pretty light on this Gundam, but if I was doing heavier weathering, my scratches would probably be less obvious. It is a bit of a challenge to find the right point between realism and effects you'll actually see, but I guess that is part of the fun. I'm applying water slide decals, and these ones are actually from Bandai, although I did have to buy them separately. Bandai's decals are a little thicker than the third-party ones I normally use, which is why I usually try to avoid them, but these ones actually surprised me. These are thinner than the ones I've used before. And I also did something which made me a bit nervous. I applied them over the bare paint. You don't need to always apply decals over a semi-gloss or glossy surface, it's just that those surfaces make it a lot less likely for you to get silvering, and the way to avoid silvering is to apply decals over an even surface. You don't need the semi-gloss, but it helps, and silvering is when you can see the decal film around the decals. I let these decals dry for around an hour, and now I'm chipping them up. I only use a knife for chipping decals because I don't want to remove too much material. If decals are too dry, they can flake off in large pieces when you chip them, and I want to avoid that. It doesn't really match with the weathering underneath. But if it's applicable, I do try to match the chipping of the decals with the chipped paint underneath. And this is easier to do for this build than my usual since I'm not having to also work through a layer of semi-gloss. After decals, I gave the model a coat of semi-gloss, and now I'm doing a pin wash. And this was a step I was a little hesitant about, just because the main color is so light. Normally I use a black wash, but that would be too stark for me even though this is a weathered build. For something this color, I've usually used a light gray, but I wanted to see how a brown would work instead. And the brown is a pretty good color for this. It's at the perfect shade where it'll provide the right amount of contrast without being too stark, but it will also simulate accumulations of dirt and general filth. I applied this pin wash a little differently from how I usually do it, in that I'm trying to avoid as little cleanup as possible just because the main color is so light. So I am taking extra care and just painting along the panel lines. I do want this to be neat, which honestly sounds counterintuitive for a weathered build. Because this brown wash is so light, I have to use several passes for it to really show up, but I guess that is better than the opposite. In certain details, I do use the wash to do some shading, just to emphasize that they are in areas that would cast more shadows. On the darker surfaces, I mix in a little black, just so I can get a color which is darker than the painted bits, but other than that, the application is exactly the same. I wanted to give some areas a bit of extra patina, so I put some of the brown wash on, and I just vertically streak it down, and this will create some streaked effects. Because I'm using a wash, it does appear a bit subtle, but I'd rather have to build an effect up instead of having something appear too heavy on the first go. And in some cases, I just load the wash onto a brush and I just make vertical streaks myself if I'm too tired and a bit too lazy to actually create streaks by removing paint. I gave things a flat coat and the finish is a little even, so I'm introducing some visual texture with some speckling. I'm starting off with some light gray because it'll break up the off-white just very slightly. And when I'm doing the speckling, if I think some of the specks are too big, I can just remove them by vertically streaking downwards. I'll then do some speckling with the brown wash I used earlier to give a subtle indication of dirt. Speckling is a great technique. Not only does it subtly add visual texture and interest, it can also tie several different colors together. Although you can influence the size of your specks with the thinness of your paint or the brush you use, it does come out very random, which is pretty important for weathering. I wanted to add a little dust. I normally don't get the chance to do it, as I mainly do space use mobile suits, but this is a ground Gundam, so I get to do some dust. And for this, I'm using some light gray pigment. I'd usually use a brown, but I wanted to see how this light gray would look. I am keeping things a bit subtle and just adding this on the feet. First, I cover the feet in the pigment with a soft brush, and I just tap it onto the surface. My main goal is to cover everything with the pigment. And then what I'll do is I'll get a damp flat brush and streak downwards, removing all of the excess. And this is nice because you don't need any sort of specialized thinners which could potentially damage the paint, and the water will evaporate in minutes, leaving streaks of pigments which simulate dust streaks. It may look a little heavy as you're doing it, but after this I'll give everything a flat coat which makes a lot of the pigment disappear. I don't know how it works, I just know that's what happens. So while you're doing this, you do want it to be a little stark. And here it is. You can probably tell, but I'm more of a Xeon fan than a Federation one. This is probably the third Gundam I've painted in 1.5 years, but I do like this kit. Weathering probably could have been taken further, but I like what I've got and I wanted to keep things a bit subtle. I felt a little nervous about weathering something this light. As usual, I don't mean this to be a statement on what exactly you should do with your weathering, but what I chose to do based on my own preferences. I want to thank you all for watching, and I'll be seeing you in the next video, whenever that is.